In this video, I want to bring about awareness and recognition of how in a lot of destructive thought patterns, many of them can be highly influenced by the work of traumatic experiences in your past and in your history. And I want to bring about just some helpful, encouraging insights and some things I've discovered that have just been so fruitful in my life and the people I've helped and have worked with in their own healing and freedom journey. Now, before I say anything further, I want you to know that my initials might be MD, but I'm not your doctor. I'm not a doctor. I'm your brother in Christ. But I still think it is very important that each of us discover and learn what it looks like to live more healed and freed and transformed as we experience transformation in our thinking and allow God to do a deep work in our hearts. And one of the areas I think we all need to be more aware of is how traumatic events in our life can have a deep, profound impact on our thinking moving forward. As I rolled up my sleeves and began doing deep heart healing, transformative work in people's lives, I was struck by a large percentage of believers who have had significant traumatic defining moments in their life. And many of them just suppressed them, shoved them down, didn't know what to do with them, dismissed them. But you could see in their story how those events had had a deep impact on how they see relationships, how they see themselves, and even how they see God. So what I want to do is, talking about trauma, is to help you to live in a balanced perspective regarding your past. Because when it comes to trauma, Christians tend to take two approaches that become ditches, that are unhealthy. Some will say, the past is the past, we don't need to talk about it. They deny, they suppress, they don't want to talk about it. And we find ways to say, well, it's just under the blood, or whatever we want to say, but really underneath that is a motive of, I don't want to go there. I'm uncomfortable even talking about it. Another extreme is we can become so paralyzed by the traumatic experiences of our past that it can really infuse a permanent victim mindset where we become victimized and we can't break free. And to be honest, I have compassion for both sides because I understand how people can fall into either area of thinking in their life. So what I want to do is invite us to come into a more grounded, balanced perspective. That you don't have to live in denial, you don't have to suppress it, you can bring it out, but you also don't have to obsess about your past. You don't have to stare at the rearview mirror. But it is helpful to recognize in your history certain things that need addressing and need healing, because many times we bullnose full stream ahead, right, in our journey, that many times we need pause and to invite God to do some work on some areas in our life that may have to do with our past. And so I'm praying that I can just bring about some awareness so we can stop telling people, just get over it. Just get over it, right? We just get impatient with each other. When you understand how trauma impacts people, it gives you a perspective of greater patience. And maybe where it needs to start is you to have greater patience over your own journey. Because many times we're impatient with others because really we're impatient with ourselves. We get tired of hearing other people's stories, and I understand that. Listen, there is a time where we got to say, you know what? I've done the work and now I need to start taking steps and moving forward. But I also think we need a lot more patience and stop screaming at people from platforms or from leadership influential places of people just get over it, where we're just yelling at people to get healed and free. It needs compassion. And many people's journeys have had lots of traumatic experiences that need addressing. So what we need is safety. And safety involves grace and love. And the power of what love means over the circumstances. And the grace of God who's patient with us in our process, in our journey. We also need avenues of care where, first, in healthy, safe relationships. Now, you would think I would say the first thing would be professional help. And even professional people would say, you need a safe tribe of people around you. Even if it's just one or two that you can process with and not be judged and condemned, so you can experience more and more the recovery found in relational interactions. And then also some people who know what they're talking about, who understand how trauma affects you, who can be prayerful for you, can give you instruction, helpful feedback in your process, and then steps, habits, and application that can begin moving you towards recovery. And trauma affects us all in different ways. For some people, certain events are not as traumatic in how it impacts them. Others, it can hit them in a whole different way. A lot of times, it has to do with our wiring leading up to that traumatic event. But what I want to do is I want to bring some illumination to trauma and help you to have greater love, grace, and patience in your journey so you can start allowing God to heal the thought patterns that you keep bumping up against that don't seem to budge. Now, what is a trauma? And there are many different aspects of definitions, and there are many ways of looking at it. But just from my discovery, what's been helpful to give people an understanding is trauma is basically a sudden, unexpected moment or event or occurrence. It's sudden. It takes you off guard to some extent. It's often disturbing. It's often distressing in how it appears to you. It shocks your system. And so in those moments, to use biblical terminology, in those moments you're not able to take your thoughts captive. It all happens so fast and so sudden that it can overwhelm your thinking patterns and it can overwhelm your coping mechanisms. So oftentimes you're just like going through it, and then it's the after effect of, wait, what just happened? And that's where some recovery and some healing is needed, because it often leaves a damaging imprint. So as you move forward, there are things that happen during those traumatic moments that leave an imprint that begin to fester, that begin to grow and entangle certain areas of thinking patterns. So this becomes an important area to address in our healing journey. Now, in my teaching, I like to keep things simple. And so when it comes to trauma, there's often the terminology of small t trauma and big T trauma. Capital T trauma, lowercase t trauma. And what I kind of discovered, and I'm sure people could add so much more to this, the large T trauma are areas that are more life-threatening, and this can even move into what's called PTS or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is diagnosed often out of these areas, and not always, but often, right? Then there's the ones that are non-life-threatening, but they're still having an impact on our thinking. And what I like to do is take the subject of trauma and bring it into awareness of certain significant moments in our history that have a heavy influence. They may not be like super heavy traumatic moments, but they were defining moments where somebody said something to you so harsh, and that has stuck with you for the rest of your life. Now, it may not be labeled technically a trauma, but it was a defining moment. And so when you understand trauma, sometimes you can understand some of those negative defining moments at your life, because you can trace certain thought patterns and go, wait, who told you that? And you can look back and go, wait, it was at that moment that thinking pattern really began. There's also the aspect of understanding three categories that are often talked about in trauma. One is acute, which means it's a single event. It was a single moment of experience that had a negative impact on your life. Then there's chronic, which means it's repeated events, where that same thing happens over and over again. But then there's another term that's used, and this is very interesting, and it has to do with complex trauma. And when you talk about complex trauma, it includes chronic, where there are repeated aspects of traumatic experiences or some form of abuse or things like that that are going on. But there's two things I've noticed in my research and in my work with people, is that there's often an unhealthy caregiver that's involved. Maybe they're narcissistic, maybe they're an addict, maybe they're just totally disconnected, disengaged, and there is severe neglect involved. And I've seen in working with people, they'll say, man, I have this thinking pattern and I don't know how this really started, and I'm trying to work through it and trying to overcome it, but I didn't have any abuse in my background. And what they don't realize is living under an environment of severe neglect where you're ignored and the needs of your life are not being met, especially When you're being raised in early childhood up into teenage years and that atmosphere of neglect is there, it can be incredibly damaging to your system. So I hope this can just bring an awareness that life events have an impact. In many cases, we don't have to obsess over trying to find that right specific moment. But oftentimes, if we just allow God to lead us in our journey, those moments bubble to the surface. If we feel His safety and His grace and knowing we're safe with God, He is a loving Father and we can process with Him, those events come to the surface and go, oh, that's where that began. Oh, that helps me make some sense of my story. God, would you come in and begin to heal this so I can establish new mindsets and begin to renounce those ways that came in, that I don't have to serve those ways of thinking anymore. I can move into safer pastures because I'm with you. I'm safer with you. Now, there are many examples of trauma. These are just some of them that we could list out to just kind of help bring about awareness in your life. It can be accidents or injuries that happen in your life that occur. It can be a sudden sickness that came upon you or a family member. Then there's the aspect of abuse, which is a big category because this can be emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. Then there's the area of spiritual abuse, which is in a church or ministry or religious environment where there is perpetual. This can be an area of chronic abuse. It can be even complex trauma kind of stuff, where I've worked with many people who've come out of that, and it took a great deal of just patient, loving, gracious relearning and reconditioning and retraining to walk out of the healing of that. Maybe it's a sudden death of a family member or a loved one that becomes very traumatic for everyone to work through. The one I want to really point out here is this issue of neglect. This is one that often goes under the radar. And it often comes through many different avenues. It can come through a very dysfunctional family that is lost in their own drama. They don't pay attention to you. This can also come out of the neglect or being ignored coming out of a passive father in the home. A large percentage of people come from homes that had an emotionally and spiritually passive father. Worked hard at work, but was not engaged in the family life, not emotionally present, didn't initiate and lead in the home. So there's a great deal of neglect that systematically has an impact on your system, and people go, I don't really know what I'm even dealing with, kind of all over the place. And it's oftentimes because they've been in an environment of neglect that God needs to become a healing presence in that area of life. Maybe it's a sudden move or lots of sudden moves in your life, constant transitions where you're shaken up out of where you live, moving into another place, having to start all over again. Moments of shame and humiliation that hit you and strike you, being made fun of, those kind of things. Harsh words where we've all come into the presence of someone who brought about harsh words that were cruel, that struck us at vulnerable moments, that stay with us, and those words echo. Maybe mom and dad's words that remain with you and you're still hearing. It sounds like you're hearing the voice of your mom or you're hearing the voice of your dad kind of still following you in certain arenas and certain environments. Maybe you've been suddenly fired from a job. And whether it was done because you needed to be fired, or it was done unjustly, but it was sudden, it just hit your system. There's the aspect of being under the influence of violence, or watching a violent environment, living in a violent environment that's very unsafe. Many times people who are raised by a parent or both parents who are alcoholics, they are exposed to a violent atmosphere because they don't know where to land, because they don't know what kind of mood they're going to get, creates a lot of mental instability, or witnessing violence or witnessing murder or witnessing some kind of intense violent event. The trauma of betrayal. It's a sudden moment of realization that someone that you thought was loyal, connected friendship, all of a sudden they turn their back on you, and it becomes a very traumatic experience. What about going back to birth experience? Maybe your birth was very, very traumatic and it shocked your system as a newborn. Now, you don't even know this. Sometimes people discover this, they have a conversation with their mom, and a whole story comes out. And that has an effect, and science and medicine agrees to that. Maybe you as a mom had and I've witnessed this many times, of moms who've had very traumatic birth experiences, and it damaged and broke their hearts. And it does take some patience and love and attention to recognize and allow God to heal how that's affecting you. Abandonment is a very, very large category of where parents abandoned, friends abandoned. It could be a divorce. Betrayal can also come to marriage, sudden betrayal where you realize an affair has been going on. Sudden financial loss, whether it is through directly to you or maybe a loved one mismanaged funds and all of a sudden you find out about it and it's directly affecting you. Things like being bullied, or things like being kicked out of a group or out of an organization or dismissed. You look at these and these just kind of give you some starters to understand these are moments in life, moments in our history. I didn't cover necessarily all of it, but just some ones for a frame of reference. As you're understanding these things, they have an effect on your thinking. So what I want to do is I want to help you in understanding how trauma has an impact and why thinking patterns that have been impacted by trauma can be tricky, just to help bring perspective so you can be more patient with yourself and be patient with others around you who you become aware of have had some traumatic experiences in their life or in their journey. And trust me, more people have these than you realize, and we need a lot of grace and compassion for each other. Well, one factor is that the event is unexpected, so it just takes you off guard. Your system is put under a tremendous amount of shock, so that makes it challenging. Number two is that you're vulnerable. There's a vulnerable state in that moment. You're emotionally vulnerable. There's a high level of uncertainty. There's a high level of not feeling prepared. There is a sense of a loss of control, a feeling out of control to a certain extent. You're not able to compose your thoughts of the event. You're not able to get perspective. That's why it's important afterwards that there is a time to just, in a healthy way, process through and reflect so that you can come to some better healthy conclusions and perspectives over what had happened. There's a sense of overwhelm where your system is overwhelmed. Now, some people may not think that they're overwhelmed. They go on high alert and they gear up and they rise to the challenge, right? They rise to the moment. Maybe they defend themselves. They help somebody else. Or maybe they fight back from somebody who is attacking them or whatever it is. Maybe they say something in defense to someone who's being abusive. And they'll think, I'm okay. But the effects often take some time to reveal themselves because traumatic moments leave an imprint. They leave an imprint on our memory. They leave a story and perspective around the event. And then there's belief systems and thoughts that we carry. Some of them can be healthy. Some of them can be not so healthy. I have found many times that people can tend to I just want to move on and get past this and just move on. And they just want to shove it back, and just get on with life. Now, in certain events in life, just need to move forward. But we need some wisdom to understand that sometimes we try to move on too quick. Then down the road, there are certain habits kicking up. There's certain anger and mood swings. There's certain addiction habits we're being drawn to. We're checking out and isolating a little bit. And sometimes a loved one needs to kindly say, hey, it might be good to just address this thing or this issue that had happened. Traumatic events leave us with disempowering beliefs. They leave us with certain mindsets, perspectives. Maybe it's all men are like this. I will never be hurt again. All women are like this. I will never be. Certain vows come into play in order to defend ourselves. There becomes self-attacking thoughts, guilt kind of things that come over us that then we carry forward from that event. And this is one of the main reasons why traumatic events need some treatment, need healing, need ministry, need prayer, need support for recovery. Another reason, number 8, is many of our traumas occur when we're younger, in our youth. And so when you're a kid, you're just a kid getting by each day. You're not thinking big picture of how these significant moments affect you. It's not until later on in adult years. I find that oftentimes even in the 20s, many people in their 20s are still living as though they're invincible and bulletproof. And then when they get into their 30s and 40s, they realize, oh, wow, when that happened, wow, I've been living out of that trauma my whole life, or that significant moment that occurred. This, this is affecting me. And so people say to me, I'm 50 years old and now I'm dealing with this stuff. Well, sometimes it just takes as long as it takes to be aware so that we can understand what took place and have some healthy processing for our journey. Healing from trauma is important because when a traumatic event happens, it takes time for the effects of it to settle in. It doesn't just happen right away. And then people will notice maybe they're having sleep issues, or they're having certain things that kick up down the road, and they're not able to connect, wow, it had a connection to a traumatic moment. Traumas can often create, they can initiate damaging effects that can be challenging to identify. It's like you have an anxiety, but you can't put your finger on it. It's like you have mood swings, but you can't put your finger on it. Or you have certain problems, or you snap out in anger and you can't put your finger on it. And a trauma may have been there. Now, I'm not encouraging incessant, obsessive introspection. I find when you just seek God and you have an open heart and you're teachable, and you allow God to help make sense of some things, He'll bring these things to the surface. He has a way of doing that, and maybe you need a safe person who can process that with you. But I've also found from a spiritual standpoint, the enemy will use traumatic events as a place to gain a megaphone, to amplify the volume of certain thought patterns. And I've found 5 things that are important to think about as far as attacks he brings into our life through traumatic events. The first one being shame. Shame's the front line. It adds on also the guilt factor that works along with it. A condemning mechanism to beat you up. Of course, fear is one that you had a fight or flight mechanism kick in, and now that fight or flight mechanism gets hijacked, it's misfiring, or it's continuing in chronic fashion. Rejection, the root of rejection will really be reinforced, creating mindsets and perspectives. So I encourage a lot of people to do work in exposing the rejection mindset, because it really forms how you see God, yourself, relationships. The self-hate factor comes to beat yourself up. And then I notice a lot of people, especially if it's a sexual trauma or some kind of relational trauma, they'll have feelings of uncleanness, sexual uncleanness, that can lead to certain patterns or behaviors moving forward, acting out of that. And so it's helpful to get some healing, some freedom over those areas of your life, and breaking agreements and realizing those thoughts began at those times. One of the concerns of trauma is the isolation factor, where you can have a tendency to pull back relationally. And those of you that are loved ones and you notice this, it's important to have a sense of compassion, to be aware of this. When you see somebody pulling back, is it because of a traumatic event, something that's hit their system hard? Have they been under a chronic or complex system of stuff that's just hit them, and now they're just really worn out and they're isolating, and maybe depression's coming in and kicking in? So these are some things to just understand. I want to enhance your compassion so that we're encouraging each other in the healing process. Now, what I want to do is I want to encourage you by giving you 4 mindsets or 4 approaches that I think are critical and important in the process of healing a trauma. Now, what I won't do is I won't jump into use this method and that thing, and people write to me and say, well, what about this technique and that technique? What about this prayer model? What about this healing modality? What about this pathway? What I would rather do is I would rather just give you an overall mindset, especially because I'm a believer in Christ, and I believe that God is someone who can be ever present as a father to bring healing into your life. He'll use relationships, He'll use mentors, He'll use professional people, He'll use all kinds of resources in your life. But what I want to do is direct your heart to point it to who God can be in this situation. So what I want is I want to encourage the power of love. So the first thing that I want to encourage you in is the power of God's loving acceptance. First and foremost, we have to learn to experience the power of God's love. God is love. to experience Him in His loving acceptance that He accepts you right where you are. And even in your traumatic kick-ups, it's okay that you're not okay. He receives you in His love. Now, I have found in my life, in my journey, I have to give that to myself. That God offers it, and I can say, yeah, but I need to practice self-acceptance. That I need to look in the mirror with all the trauma, the drama, the heartache, the things I've gone through, to be able to look at myself and say, it's okay that I'm not okay right now. I'm loved, I'm accepted. That's the first step in calming the waters. It starts to push shame out, self-hate out, starts to push some of that rejection out. It nurtures my heart. Nurture is so key. And how do we receive nurture? By allowing loving acceptance to begin to come into our life. Anyone who's experienced any kind of traumatic moment, a significant moment in their life that negatively affect them, we need nurturing love that communicates loving acceptance. Then what we need is the patience of love. This is huge. And most people who I've worked with that have had traumatic events that are pretty significant in their life, they lose patience with themselves. They expect themselves to be healed and well 10 years ago. So that brings on pressure, it adds intensity, and it hinders the healing process. So patience is going to be necessary. Patience says, this will take as long as it takes. So take a deep breath and allow yourself to go on the journey, because you're on a journey. You're not in a rush to a destination. Number 3 is the power of kindness. I need to start interrupting the negative self-talk, or maybe some of the judgmental, condemning, pharisaical self-talk that we engage in. And I need to insert the language of kindness and ask myself, what does love say right now? What does God in His love say right now? Because many people with traumatic histories can be very hard on themselves, very judgmental, very accusatory, very guilt-ridden, right? So we need to learn the language of God's loving kindness over our life. And then from there, we start to take loving steps forward in our healing process. This is very important because you can't force this, rush this, or militantly push yourself through it. There are days where you'll have to get up and you feel like you're drudging through cement, but you take the step anyways. But the goal is, I want to have the steps I'm taking forward be an act of love, receiving that love from God and taking steps as an act of love towards my healing journey. And so these become a very powerful force of God's love to move you into the direction of greater healing. Now, I will have some other resources on some habits and steps you can take that I've found in people I've worked with in many, many different circles and backgrounds that have been helpful in healing thinking patterns that come out of trauma. But this just gets the atmosphere started. I encourage you to get a copy of The Heart Healing Journey. I talk more about this and helping you put in perspective what you've been through. So in God's love and grace, He can walk you into the healing journey with greater fruit. I pray this is a blessing to your life.